guys, we are doing another reading from The Scariest Stories You've Ever Heard, Part 3. This is Dead Man's Hill. Dead Man's Hill had been a legend around Willisburg for as long as anyone could remember. It was a medium-sized sloping hill on the edge of town. There weren't any houses on Dead Man's Hill. Mostly it was a place for town picnics or long walks. Some of the younger boys in town would take their dirt bikes and four-wheelers up the hill and ride through the paths that crisscrossed its crest, but only during the day. Hardly anyone visited Dead Man's Hill at night. The legend of Dead Man's Hill was just too frightening. Most people figured that the legend probably wasn't true. But what if it was? Most of the kids around Willisburg knew that it was best not to take any chances. Someone had died on Dead Man's Hill almost 50 years ago. The whole thing had started out as a club initiation. Just a few boys daring each other to ride their motorcycles to the edge of the hill and then to make the sharp turn just before they reached the edge of the cliff. The rocky crags on the hill's other side were treacherous. Any rider who didn't make the turn in time would fall to a terrible death, and that's just what happened that night. According to the legend, young Greg Thompson had not wanted to join his buddies, Tom and Larry, on their nightly ride around the hill, but they had taunted him and called him a chicken. Since he was the newest member of their club, he had wanted to prove himself. There was nothing worse than being called a chicken. So he had taken their dare to rev his motorcycle and head down the hill toward the curve at breakneck speed. He was supposed to turn his motorcycle just in time, but he hadn't. He had kept going. His unearthly scream broke the night as he plunged over the cliff, and when Tom and Larry found him, his neck was broken and his head was twisted completely around. But that wasn't the worst part of the legend. The worst part was to happen 4 days later, the night of Greg's funeral. That night, Tom and Larry had been found dead in their beds, their heads twisted completely around. There were no signs of forced entry, no signs of struggle, no signs of any weapons at either of their homes, just the boys themselves, their bodies horribly contorted. Whoever or whatever had done this to the boys had been stronger than any man. People said that Greg Thompson's ghost had come back from the dead to seek revenge on the boys who had taunted him, and some people said that Greg's ghost still haunted Dead Man's Hill and the treacherous curve. But nobody really knew if the legend was true or not. It was this legend that Jason Bauman told Andy Johnston one lonely summer night in Willisburg. Andy was new in town and didn't know how seriously to take his new friend. Jason said that it was up to every new kid in town to take a spin on Dead Man's Hill just to prove he was man enough for the town of Willisburg. Andy had come to town with a new dirt bike, and Jason had just gotten a new ATV. The sun wouldn't set for some time now. It seemed like a perfect night for trail riding and for Andy to prove that he was no chicken. Jason's eyes lit up as he told Andy about the awesome rocky paths. Before Andy knew it, they were heading for Dead Man's Hill as the sun was dipping lower and lower in the horizon. Andy tried to put the legend out of his mind as his dirt bike approached the crest of the hill. He knew that the famous downhill run with the sharp curve and craggy bluffs lay on the other side. Jason was behind him and shouted over the noise of their motorcycles, "Time to prove you're a man!" Andy shook his head. Just then he caught a glimpse of a figure lurking in the trees, a dark figure, heading his way. "Hey, who's that guy?" Jason asked. "Maybe he's up for the Dead Man's Hill challenge too." "I don't know," Andy answered as the figure came closer. "I'm new here, remember?" Andy could see now that the figure was a boy about his age, dressed in some old clothes that looked like they came from the Salvation Army. Andy couldn't see the guy very well in the dark, but it looked like his eyes were bloodshot, and his skin seemed to glow faintly in the fading twilight. "Can either of you guys give me a ride into town?" the figure asked, gesturing to the dirt bike and the ATV. "Some of my friends dropped me off up here. It was sort of a joke, you know." "Sure," Jason said with a glint in his eye. "But first, we're going to try this old curve at 60 miles per hour, right, Andy?" Andy just looked down at the ground. "You're not a real man unless you can take the curve of Dead Man's Hill, you know," Jason said. "At least you should give it a try." Andy nodded his head weakly. The stranger smiled. "Hey, I know all about Dead Man's Hill. You know what's even better than taking the curve solo, don't you?" he asked. Jason shook his head. "Taking that run 2 at a time. The extra weight really makes you fly down that hill. If you can make the curve with 2 on board, then you know you're really tough." Andy looked at his dirt bike and then at Jason's four-wheeler. He knew how dangerous it was to ride 2 on a four-wheeler. After all, it wasn't that safe to ride on one by yourself. But he could tell by the look in Jason's eye that this stunt was just one more in the list of stunts that Jason felt would make him cool, make him a man. Andy couldn't believe that this strange kid would want to join them on this insane stunt. "Well," Jason said to the stranger, hesitating only a little, "climb aboard." "Jason," Andy started, "maybe you'd better not." "Geez," Jason said, "once a wimp, always a wimp. Come on, he gestured to the stranger. Hop on. The stranger climbed onto the ATV behind Jason. Andy looked down at his hands on the handlebars of his dirt bike. They were shaking slightly. You want to race or what? Jason asked Andy. Nah, Andy said. I think I'll just watch you guys try it first. You know, see how it's done. Okay, wimp, Jason said, taking off with the red-eyed stranger behind him. Andy watched as Jason revved his four-wheeler. The ATV began heading down the slope. It was then that Andy saw the most hideous sight he had ever seen. The stranger was transforming himself right in front of Andy's eyes. First, the stranger's eyes popped out of his head, and then bloody blue and red veins popped from his face. The skin seemed to peel away by itself, almost like an orange, revealing pink muscles beneath. And then the muscles began peeling away, dripping blood. Andy took off on his bike behind Jason. He had to warn him before it was too late. He had to make him get off his four-wheeler before he got to the curve. But it was too late. By the time they reached the end of the slope, the stranger was no more than a skeleton, a laughing, hideous skeleton with his bony hands around Jason's neck. The skeleton was twisting poor Jason's neck around and around. As the two headed for the cliff, Andy knew that they couldn't turn off in time. He held his breath and closed his eyes. The next sound he heard was a scream and an unearthly laugh. And then Andy heard words he would never forget. You're next, a voice whispered. You're next. When they found Jason the next day, his head was completely turned around, facing backward. Andy tried to tell everyone that the legend of Dead Man's Hill would come full circle, that the skeleton would claim another victim. He even tried to get his parents to move out of town or to send him to live with his grandmother in another town. Anything to escape the horrible fate of those whispered words, you're next, you're next. But no one believed Andy. They all thought he was just shaken up by Jason's death. His parents told him that his imagination was running wild, that he had had a bad scare and needed to take it easy for a while. No one believed Andy's story of the horrible stranger who had lured Jason to his death, at least not until the morning after Jason's funeral. That was when they found Andy's body in his bed, his neck broken, his head completely turned around. On his face was a look of unspeakable horror. Have a spooky day.